There's a lot of competition today at Westminster, a lot of things going on, but we're really happy to have Michele with us. My name is Kay Thomas. I'm on the Community Partners Committee, and the social justice forums are built around a common theme this year. The theme is moving from understanding to transformation, affecting change together, guided by God. Through these forums, we want to explore capabilities we need to build and norms we need to examine in order to be effective transformation partners in our community. So on this World Communion Sunday, we are really pleased to welcome Michele Garnett McKenzie, who is the Deputy Director of Advocates for Human Rights, which is a wonderful organization, incidentally. Editorial comment. And she is a Deputy Director, and she heads up the organizational research, education, and advocacy branches within Advocates. A big job. And is also the lead on their communication strategy. But before we get started, there's a couple items. For those of us here in the MISA room, when we get to the question and answer period, we want you to speak into a microphone, and we will bring the microphone, or I will bring the microphone out to you. The reason for that is several people are online hearing us virtually, and we want to make sure that they can fully participate and hear what's going on. And those of you who are attending on live stream, please put any questions that come up for you in the chat, and we will be monitoring the chat. And you'll be able to ask your questions there. So as part of our ongoing effort to promote respectful conversations and around concerns in the community, the social justice team has established guidelines for the social justice forums that you can't see on screen. We have a bit of a technical issue right now. But let me read this to you and think about it and internalize it as we are together this morning. Westminster's social justice forums provide us with the opportunity to learn and interact with ideas. The social justice ministry team hopes the forum inspired us to further God's justice in the world. Toward that end, the team is offering these guidelines for the question and answer time. First, equity of voices. We benefit from hearing a variety of voices. Let's leave room for other perspectives. 2, encourage curiosity. As we encounter new ideas, we benefit from asking genuinely curious or clarifying questions. 3, concise questions. Because our time is limited, we will limit preambles to questions. 4, generous listening. We'll listen from the heart with compassion. And 5, honoring the image of God. We'll avoid stereotypes and generalities, especially those related to specific racial and ethnic members of our community. So before we get started, let's start with a short prayer. Dear God, God of justice, breathe into us today a spirit of curiosity and humility. Help us engage with mindfulness, following the lead of voices from our community. Guide our speech and our self-awareness so we may honor the divine in all people. Amen. So now let's welcome Michele.
I'll take that. Thank you. Take your respectful Q&A guidelines with you. Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Kay, for that introduction and setting the stage. And everyone, I know it is a busy Sunday here, and I'm glad that some of you are here with us to talk about how we might change the world for good on this Communion Sunday. it is, I think, the best day to be talking about human rights in this spirit of what can we do together and what are those shared values and shared opportunities. And before, I mean, thank you also to Westminster, not just for letting us be here from time to time, but for being community partners, for support and volunteer. There are many volunteers from the Westminster community at our organization, so thank you for that. So who are we? Who is the Advocates for Human Rights? As you can see, we turned 40 this year, so we're solidly middle-aged. We are, for a decade, I could say you couldn't trust us because we were over 30, but I was losing my younger audience there. We're a multi-issue human rights organization that is based here in Minneapolis. We were founded on the spirit of social justice that really is part of the Minnesota community. And through 40 years of partnerships, we've worked in our home community and around the globe. We counted up, as part of this anniversary, the number of countries we've reported on human rights conditions with partners, and it's 109, I believe, this year. So we've been in places around the world, but also really focused on human rights issues in Minnesota, and see those two as the same thing. We are part of the world, and human rights affect each and every one of us, no matter where we live. We've worked on different things throughout the years, of course. Different priorities and projects have come and gone, but today we're working really to combat authoritarianism and the effects on LGBTIQ plus folks and women's human rights defenders, and the increasingly perilous space in which people are existing. We have clients coming from around the globe solely based on their sexual orientation or gender identity or expression because they fear for their lives. And their activism has put them in the crosshairs of their government. Women's human rights defenders we've worked with for years who are fleeing their own countries because the work they do to run a domestic violence shelter has caused them to become a government enemy. And colleagues we have lost because of that work. We are also working to abolish the death penalty worldwide, and this is one area where I'm just overwhelmed by the success and the trajectory upon which we have embarked. I think at every staff meeting this year, our international justice monitoring team has noted how another country is either considering or has abolished the death penalty. It has been a continuing journey toward saying this method of punishment doesn't allow for any mistakes. It often keeps people on death row for years or decades in incredibly cruel conditions and isn't the right direction for the world to go. And the United States is becoming an outlier in the global community around death penalty. So this is something, when we think about where have we come, often we're thinking, oh, things are going badly, but sometimes progress is being made and we celebrate that progress. And we also work to protect the rights of migrants. And this is one of the areas where our work is most local. We do work directly with people who are seeking asylum. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that is and how that presents here. We are working with thousands. Our organization is working to try to help some of the thousands of children who've arrived in Minnesota in the last 3 years. Their kids, unaccompanied children, are coming at about a rate of 1,000 a year to Minnesota families and homes, and are here facing immigration proceedings all by themselves. It's really, it is one of the most absurd applications of our justice system to see 3- and 4-year-olds in court by themselves trying to make their case. And we work with people who are in immigration detention. We are representing and providing legal support for the Afghan arrivals who are making their way slowly through the immigration process here. And increasingly working with people who are victims of trafficking, as we are becoming better as a community about identifying human trafficking and people who need that assistance. We're a volunteer-based organization, and that means we have about 1,000 to 1,500 people every year working hands-on on cases, on research, travel, on advocacy, court monitoring out at the immigration courts and in Hennepin and Ramsey and Washington County courts to monitor trials affecting gender-based violence. And this volunteer spirit is really it's not just how we get our work done, but it's why we do our work, right? We believe that each of us has a part to play in defending human rights. We all have a part to play. This is an invitation. Like we really all have something to give to the defense of human rights. It might be time, it might be expertise, it might be just showing up, it might be language, it might be talent, it might be just your vision. We all have a part to play in defending human rights. That's also a call. Right? It's not just an invitation, it's an obligation. Everyone has a part to play means we all have to do our part. And human rights don't become real if we're fine with letting them be violated most of the time, and once in a while we say something is wrong, or we're fine making public policy decisions that are based on a different framework and don't consider the dignity of the human being who's affected by those policies. So that's where we've come in our 40 years. But alongside this is also the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights this year. So 75 years ago, on December 10th, coming up, the world community created and sat down and created a list of principles, of guidelines, of rules, of expectations, of rights for each of us. And I think on Communion Sunday, where you're looking at the common values and the strength of that shared agenda of values, you can see the power of a global document that says, this is what everyone has a right to. It's a global commitment to powerful, practical principles. And it was a really game-changing agenda because it put in to law and into our obligations and even into just our idea, the thought that an individual has rights because we are a human being, and that the government who governs our lives has a duty to respect, protect, and fulfill those rights. So it's not just that I have the right to exist or I have the right to express who I am, but the government has to make sure I'm safe in doing that. It's not just that I have the right to freedom or to safety, it's that the government has to make sure that my husband is held accountable if he beats me in my home. Right? And that was not on the agenda in 1948. That was not necessarily how we all arranged our laws around the world. The 75th anniversary gives you a sense of the time in which this document was created, though. I mean, it was certainly responding to and a product of its time. It was responding to the horrors of World War II and the world in which it was created. And so there are gaps. There are anachronisms. There is language that we look at and say, ooh, I'm not sure that's how we would express it today. But it's also a process for achieving the realization of our rights. And so it's a living document, and there has been so much work done under this framework that allows us to continue to envision, what does human dignity really mean? And which humans are included when we say that human rights are inalienable or they're afforded to every single person? They were written to provide basic guarantees against things like torture and extrajudicial executions and arbitrary detention. And those rules still need to be in place because the clients we work with in our asylum practice are fleeing exactly that kind of conduct. And the people who are killed by police in the United States are also subject to extrajudicial execution in violation of international standards. It's a real need to still prohibit that and think about that. But it also guarantees us freedom of things like thought and conscience and religion, speech, education, work, that people really have the right to human dignity, right? And that is, in the preamble to the Universal Declaration, we talk about the recognition of the inherent dignity and the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family as the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace. And you think about that, like, if we had recognition of dignity for every person, would people be fleeing their homes? Would people have to live in shelters? What would happen if we realized this? This is a vision for us all. Now, it recognized those rights. It created, like I say, accountability, or at least the need for accountability for violations. And it's really premised on this concept of dignity. And when I was sharing, I ran into some people at the Minnesota State Fair. We table out at the Minnesota State Fair. It's a very fun volunteer activity. It's a focus group for 12 days of people's opinions about human rights. And I had some folks come up who were dressed in garb that suggested they had an anti-human rights agenda. That was my premise, looking at them. I thought, oh dear. And they came up and they said, human rights for who? Well, you and me, us, And we started talking, and we realized that they were struggling for recognition of human dignity for their daughter who's gay and who was being rejected by some of their friends and family members because they had an agenda that did not look at the human dignity of that person. And they were really hurt by that, and they were starting to think, maybe this is the right place to be. It was an interesting and transformative conversation, I hope, for them, and certainly was for me. And it really today, as we think about that language of universality, we're thinking about how we can embrace and recognize and protect the diversity of every human being. When we think about inalienability, it reminds us that we can't negotiate these away. So, this is powerful stuff. But if we've had human rights for 75 years, why are there so many human wrongs, right? What is going wrong? If we've got this powerful framework and we know what we should do and everybody should have dignity, why don't we? Because that's clear, right, that we don't. In some ways, I think sometimes our standards are changing and we're demanding more, and that's good. Like, what was good enough 40 years ago isn't good enough to us today. So that's exciting and speaks to that process. But as one of our founders, Don Fraser, who some of you might remember, Don was our congressman, our mayor, also was a founder of the Advocates, said human rights should be the central organizing principle for the planet, right? But we know public policy is really typically not made based on human rights principles. Think about the public policy debate you're having over at the legislature, and you probably sit in, Betty, on like 5 million hearings throughout the session. How many of them are premised on, does this make every person who's affected by this law better, safer, more stable, and recognize the human dignity in that person? Is that usually the measure? Is there a dignity note that the Office of the Reviser has to produce for every bill? No, right? It's a fiscal note, right? Most of our policy decisions are made for other reasons, often cost, and often with this sort of presumption that we have scarcity and we have to figure out how to keep people from using the things that they need, right? Think about our food safety, food security system. If you want food stamps, it's not like you can just go and say, I'm hungry and I need food, which is pretty much the most basic human right? Food for people. You have to prove that you're eligible. You have to send in proof every month that you're eligible. You have to make sure that you remain eligible. And the idea behind the system design is so that people stop applying, not everybody makes it in, they fall off, and then we can manage our scarce resources, right? What if we design the system with the presumption that every human being eats, and every human being needs to eat food? Let's start with that radical proposition, and then build the system from there, as opposed to we have a small pool of food, and let's figure out who doesn't need food. And when I'm talking about this, it's real rules. Like if you have a felony conviction, you're disqualified from federal financial aid or financial supports. Okay. Well, just because you had a felony conviction doesn't mean you no longer need housing or food, right? But it does in many ways. And it's false. It's a false narrative. It's short-sighted. We know there's money. Extreme poverty rose for the first time in 25 years in 2020, but extreme wealth during that time rose by an estimate of $2.6 trillion to billionaires in that same time period. Well, there's money. We're making choices on where we put it and who gets it, and sometimes that means some people just don't get food. And so for me as an immigration lawyer, because that's mainly what I've spent my practice on, nowhere is this failure to have a human rights-based policy more apparent than in migration policy and immigration policy right now. Following World War II, right after that Universal Declaration of Human Rights was signed, we created the refugee framework, the asylum framework, and transformed global migration rules and assumptions by creating the right to seek and enjoy asylum from persecution. That was a radical change, and it overrode a government's decision to exclude on any basis anyone who they wanted, no matter what, if the person had a well-founded fear of persecution on account of their race, their religion, their nationality, their social group, their political opinion. It reflected the lived horror of Nazi Germany and the reality that if no one will let you in, you can't get out, right? That is axiomatic. This human rights mandate allows people to escape human rights violations. It has saved millions of people's lives. It has allowed people to continue, their families to continue to live and thrive. It's transformed our communities for the better, I would say. If you look at the most baseline level, the available restaurant options in the Twin Cities, you know that there's been a positive impact and an economic impact as well. It's a powerful example of how a human rights-based policy can transform public policy. But people are on the move in huge numbers. People are on the move beyond what asylum affords. Asylum is one essential piece of a human rights-based migration framework, but it's not the only one. It's just the only one we've gotten to. We stopped our work short, and we are selling ourselves short on that. Right now, there's an estimated 281 million migrants worldwide. There were only, let's see if I can go back. Of these folks who are forcibly displaced, most are internally displaced, so not even migrants. There's only about 40 million refugees in the world. So 281 million migrants is a lot of people who aren't falling within the protection and the scope of the asylum system, but still need to be able to migrate and move with dignity, right? Because despite increased, mobility, like there are better planes. You don't have to take a ship that takes 3 months, a sailing ship, 3 months across the ocean to get from one continent to another. People can move more readily now than they could before. And increased technology and a completely globalized economy, our immigration laws are really still the same as they were before World War II. In the United States, our last immigration system reform was, anybody want to guess the year? Anyway? 1965, right? That's when we restructured our immigration system for the last time. This is premised on a whole different world. It doesn't have the reality that people move embedded into the migration system. It's leading to really dangerous migration conditions. And it fails to make real the guarantee that we have under international human rights law that nobody should be sent back to human rights violations, even if it's outside the scope of asylum. I said asylum gives protection to people who fear persecution by their government or a group the government can't or won't control because of the person's identity, their race, their religion, their beliefs, their race, religion, nationality, social group, political opinion. But what if you just are afraid that you will starve to death if you are sent back to your country because you can't afford food? The government doesn't provide food for you. The economy doesn't provide food for you. You will starve. That's not an asylum claim. That is anything but an asylum claim. But there's an international standard that says we shouldn't deport people back to face gross human rights violations. We're just ignoring that right now. What if you live somewhere that is becoming impossible for you to live because of climate change? You live on an island that will be underwater. That's actually happening to people. Desertification, just changes that make it arable land or no longer safe to live. That's not an asylum claim. But that's all we've got as a global community right now is an asylum system that is, we're trying to stuff other things into, if possible, because people move and they need to move. And we can't leave people to their deaths just because we don't have a mechanism that should be there. It's leading to, these are some of our client journeys. You can just see the massive web of both irregular migration in purple and regular authorized migration through refugee resettlement. People are moving to Minnesota in complicated and often really dangerous ways. We've heard a lot of reporting about the Darien Gap migration. Probably many of you have seen this in the newspapers and on TV about this incredibly difficult pass that people used to, it was really rare that we would encounter somebody here seeking asylum who had managed to get through the Darien Gap. And now children are routinely being funneled through there with their parents. This is like a freight train driving through this area because there has been an infrastructure built to respond to the human migration needs. Technology's helping people find migration tourists, essentially, find how to move. And it's leading to trafficking, it's leading to smuggling, it's leading to economic profiteering, and really embedding some of this migration economy into local economies. So that's going to make it harder to disentangle, because as communities become dependent on the dollars of people coming in from one place to another and spending money there, who wants to give that up, right? But we don't have anything else created. As I said, the last time we changed our system was back in 1965. So what are some of the ways we could get out of this? And there's a framework being negotiated. It's called the Global Compact for Migration, and it articulates a balance of things. I'm not entirely sure how it will play out, but it's the first hopeful agenda for immigration reform that to me makes real sense. It calls for predictable channels of migration that people can access and that are safe, right? Not just workarounds of a system that wasn't designed for them. So the US immigration system right now, there's a few ways to come here permanently. One is as a refugee, or by getting granted asylum. Most people come through an immediate family or a very close family member. filing papers for them. And some people, about 15% of people who immigrate, come through employment-based. That's it. There's no other route. There's no other way. So if we've got a brittle system that was really designed to do what it's doing, exclude and expel most people, and bring in a few people based on relationships or characteristics we want, what does that leave? It leaves people in the margins. It leaves people unprotected. Right now, I mentioned we have unaccompanied children coming to the U.S. About 1,000 coming released to people who live in Minnesota each year in the last several years. There is a mechanism where kids who've been abused, abandoned, or neglected can apply for a green card in the United States so that they can integrate, kind of find stability, grow up, and move on with their lives. Good. There's a cap on the number of those visas, those green cards that are given out every year. And we have now hit a point where if you apply for stage 1, you get it, you will have that visa available in over a decade because we have 100,000 kids waiting in line for 10,000 visas a year. Well, that's not going to work. That's not how it should work. That's happening all over the system because people move, right? So a people-centered migration policy that thinks about not just the migrant themselves, but also the communities that are producing and transiting and receiving migrants, because everybody has dignity, and so all of those community needs need to be brought into account. A human rights-based policy that thinks about the safety and security and dignity of the migrant who's navigating the system, trying to figure out where to go, make plans, build a family, resume or continue a career, not just flee from one place to another, but remain the whole person that they are. A human rights-based system, or a system that minimizes the adverse drivers of migration in the first place. Right? A lot of us, if you are, I know we have some non-US citizen visitors here in the room now, but if you are a Minnesotan and were born in Minnesota, how many of you know, it is hard to leave Minnesota, right? We stay where we are. We are a people who like to not move, right? So think what it would take to propel us into migration from our homes here, because we found safety and security and dignity and love and community. People don't want to just throw that away to go move around, right? Most people move for good reasons, or when they're very young and they are out for adventure. We don't like to be displaced, right? We need to expand available and flexible pathways for migration that allow somebody like a kid to travel for safety, to meet up with a brother or sister here. We could have that system. Work-based visas that allow people to move around for the kind of work that is done, not just to move the goods and services, or the goods around, so that we can get them produced in the cheapest manner possible. We need to think about ways that can account for slow onset and sudden climate incidents. We can see some things coming, and some things just happen abruptly. We have no mechanism to protect people and allow them to move in our system today. So when we're thinking about a human rights-based policy, thinking about all those elements actually gives us something that we could ask Congress for. We could create. It's not just stop doing what we're doing, or we're not doing enough, or make it bigger. It's thinking about elements that really would promote human dignity. So where does that leave us? Well, it means we have to do, we have to do our part, right? We have to show up at the Capitol and say, we have to deal with housing and feeding the folks who are coming to Minnesota at the rate of about 375 arrivals a week from the southern border right now. We have to make sure that the kids that may or may not get a visa in 10 years still can settle and have access to school and food and a safe environment here while they're waiting. We have to think about where people have access to housing and food, because an undocumented immigrant in Minnesota remains largely outside of any of the basic needs supports that we have. We do have driver's licenses now, thankfully, as of today. As of today, it's driver's license Sunday too. But a driver's license with no path to staying stably here is just one tool to making people safer and less at risk. So we have to show up and do our part there. And one way you can do that is volunteering. We do have, I think, our court observers out there. We've had over 1,000 individuals in the last 5-6 years out at the Fort Snelling Immigration Court just monitoring hearings, doing trial monitoring for us. They're in our detained court, non-detained court, and in the kids-only hearings to identify gaps, create accountability, build transparency, and actually get people familiar with where the real breakdowns in the system are. We need volunteer attorneys. If anybody wants to know how to be a volunteer attorney with us, just ask Dwayne. Mr. Kroenke has been one for years and years and years, and he could tell you all about being a volunteer attorney and why it matters, because it does. It can transform lives, and we can't possibly do the work that needs to be done without the whole community showing up to do that. Being an interpreter, really being part of the solution is just one piece. So I'll leave it there. That is, the vision, I think, that we have, that human rights aren't a matter of charity. They're not a reward for obeying the rules. They are inalienable entitlements of every one of us, whoever we are. And we need to claim that and demand it of the policies we set. So if there are questions, I'm happy to take those. And I see, okay, one over there and then one in the middle. And we've got a few minutes before adjournment. So.
Michele, Westminster, with the assistance of the Minnesota Council of Churches, they co-sponsor of an Afghan family, who are not refugees, and there's been a bill pending, the Afghan Adjustment Act. The last session of Congress was ready to pass it, and Senator Grassley from Iowa stopped it from passing. And dysfunctional U.S. Congress makes all of this very difficult. But anything happening there?
Indeed, it does. Thanks for that uplifting. Now, first, thank you for this actually stepping forward and doing the sponsorship of Afghan families. It's a way to really think about, to understand what this really means. It isn't just about the visa, it's about all the rest of what the human beings and the families needed. The Afghan folks did come not as refugees, even though they were refugees, because we didn't put them through our refugee resettlement process under Section 207 of the Immigration and Nationality Act, because there wasn't time. And this was one of the hopeful areas where we actually did some creative thinking and said, what can we do quickly to make sure we can do our duty to get people to safety? So people were paroled in. The Afghan Adjustment Act is in Congress again, and negotiations are underway to get it attached to the Defense Appropriations Bill. So now that there has been a change with I think the budget was just signed, so we've got a little breathing room. We'll see what Defense Act appropriations look like. There's a lot that needs to be attached to that bill to keep our nation moving. And that is the only vehicle right now politically that allows something like the Afghan Adjustment Act to go. Nothing is getting through on its own. So the dysfunction, the political dysfunction, is absolutely crippling our ability to do the right thing. It could happen this year, Dwayne. It's possible. It's in play, but I have no idea, and it's just a roll of the dice. So anybody who has any clout with the Iowans or anyone else should be calling, because it is going to come down to horse trading in the most blatant political moves, that we have, whether this happens. the Afghan Adjustment Act would allow people to stop spinning their wheels in very complicated procedures and just apply for green cards and move on. So it's like these most, what do they say, no-brainer of the possible solutions, and yet that has not brought us to something.
Thank you. So maybe taking a tangent off of that question, I have worked on efforts that involve a founding on human rights. So this is not a statement of my value of the notion, but I wonder, how do we make it feel more powerful to people? Because there's so much tribalism, and I just wonder if human rights is just like something that doesn't resonate enough with people's hearts.
I think that's a really well articulated observation, and one of the most frustrating sort of dangers that or traps we've gotten ourselves into is to talk about human rights as a theoretical treaty framework that, like nobody cares. Zero people care about that. But talking to, and I go back to the conversation with the folks at the fair, talking about what it really means, not about what the framework says and the accountability, but it's about dignity. And dignity is a powerful driving force. We can tell, like, when are we most hurt as human beings? It's when somebody denies our humanity. When they look past us because, I'm a woman, or I'm short, or I'm old. These are the things that make me feel invisible, and they make me feel hurt and powerless and defensive and angry, right? And that happens to all of us. We're in some space we are in, our dignity as human beings is denied, and that shouldn't happen to anybody. And that's something that's a very real human piece. And I think where we've seen human rights-based legislation, which we do see, it's when we're recognizing that dignity and claim, two bills or two things that have happened in Minnesota in the last few years, to me are some of the most promising human rights mechanisms that we could have. And they're the creation of the Office of Missing and Murdered Indigenous Relatives and the Office of Missing and Murdered African American Women and Girls. And that office is just getting underway. It passed this session. The Indigenous Relatives Office is now underway and working. And their premise, they're embedded in law enforcement. They're at the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension and the OJP, but they are predicated on conversations with people who were victims of crimes that were ignored or facilitated by our law enforcement, our state government. A big chunk of the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Report focused on human trafficking and the role that law enforcement played historically in that, the role that white people played in buying and selling Native women and their bodies. It's a gross human rights violation, and the state's a part of it, and we are a part of it. And it's been these crimes have gone unsolved, uninvestigated, uncared about for years. And when we started talking to people who were actually affected by those crimes, real policy changed. And I think that's going to really move forward. That's about what human rights is about. Who's affected by that violation? How can they claim their human dignity? And how can we stop that from happening again? Like, that's just an incredibly powerful piece. And it doesn't have to ever say anything about a treaty, except maybe broken treaties in native land here. But it doesn't have to say anything about the international framework. What are the values that spark that? We can replicate that. We can do that every day in our policymaking. Or we can choose to be like, well, crime fighting's expensive, and we don't have enough to fight everything, so we're going to pick what we do, which has typically been our go-to, right? Betty? Oh, and then. Thank you. And then you can just pass to your neighbor.
Okay. Yeah, this is all going to get mushed together, but first of all, it was lovely to see Arvon and Don Fraser there. They were my neighbors for a number of years here, and I love them. And their work has been extraordinary. There was an earlier slide that showed that of the immigration, migration, 45% are women, and then it had another reference to young people, but I wanted to see what's the total. Is it like, it's 2/3 are women and children?
Yeah.
And then can you speak from that perspective also about CEDAW,
Yeah.
the Commission on the Eradication of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women? I know that, you just were talking about femicide and uxoricide, which is one of the problems.
Right. Just next, there we go. Yeah, so the migration totals or sort of population totals it's clear that it's not just like breadwinners going to work in migrant labor pools or things, that it is about women and children in migration, but I don't know if it's 2/3 together or not. Those statistics are all available from the International Office of Migration, and they do those sort of regular counts of things. So off the top of my head, I don't have the breakdown, but we know it affects people who are like at the beginning of their lives and are going to set the stage for decades to come. And if trauma is inflicted upon children, that doesn't just go away when they grow up or when they find stability or whatever. That gets carried with them, and that has costs to all of us, right? Unaddressed childhood trauma of migration is something that we just ignore, and it to our peril. So thinking about the policies that would support safety for women in migration against sexual violence. I know some of our partners in Central and Eastern Europe, when the Syrian migration crisis was really ramped up through Europe, were for the first time dealing with migrants in their communities, in Bulgaria and Moldova, and just were completely unprepared to deal with rape victims who spoke different languages. So it's got to be that whole of government and whole of society effort to eradicate and to think about violence against women for everybody moving through. On CEDAW, I think having them, and they are continuing to monitor women in migration as well, and seeing those intersectional areas. It's not just migrants here and women here, but it's people and presenting in things, and the universal periodic review of looking at all human rights obligations for countries at one time, not just in silos, has been a step forward in that accountability as well.
So going back to immigration and immigration reform, which right now feels impossible, but if we're thinking that perhaps in the future we might have a different government in place, and so my understanding is that we need sort of two things. One is more funding for the immigration things we already have in place so that we don't have a 10-year wait for a visa for children. And then the other way is more options for different kinds of visas so that people who want to come here to work so that their family has food to eat can do that. Is there something else that we should be looking for? Do you have any other ideas of, like, if we're talking to people who might have a chance of doing anything that we should say to help advance those positions?
Yeah, I think you put that just beautifully, that those are two things. One is that the system we have is kind of inflated beyond belief to a game of Red Rover at the border in terms of numbers of officers at the border, and virtually sucked dry in all other areas of adjudications, of making decisions. The court here will have 7 total judges for Minnesota, North and South Dakota doing deportation cases, and they'll hit 32,000 pending cases this week. They have about 2,500 new arrival cases coming in every month. And we're making resource decisions on who gets what money, and most of it is on surveillance and border technology, and there's a ton being kind of dumped into actual intelligence surveillance systems of people who are in the U.S. and using tracking devices and looking at mobile technology. So lots of money being spent and not on making things happen for the people who are affected by it. So it's not people-centered, it's not a human rights-based thing. And then also some of those structural things, like the 10-year problem for kids is partly lack of resources and partly that we put a cap on how many kids could have that visa every year, and it backs up. We have a cap on how many victims of crime can get a green card here. Well, why do we have a cap on victims of crime? If you're a victim of crime and you're here to participate in the prosecution of that case, then maybe you should just be able to stay here. There's similar backlogs there. And then there's non-existent migration channels that we need because people use them and people move. That's an essential human endeavor. It's what makes us human. It's what has allowed us to survive as a species. And if we pretend that they won't move, we've got our head in the sand. We're hurting people when we do it. We don't have to. We can make different choices. So, okay, I think we have to wrap up because it is 10:10, and 10:10 is our stopping time. So thank you all very much.
Well, thank you very much, Michelle. I'm very happy to hear you talk and to
It's
get
always a
all
joy
your
to be here.
wisdom. I just wanted to thank people for coming today and also to give you a heads up about next week. We got another Michelle Whitty, who is the Executive Director of the League of Women Voters of Minnesota, and she'll be speaking on voting rights in Minnesota. So, hope to see you next week.
Thank you.
That's great.